One thing that the COVID pandemic has done is to uncover other major weaknesses and risks within our global healthcare system, including antimicrobial resistance. And that's the perfect segue into our next conversation. It's sponsored by Merck around partnerships and policy addressing antimicrobial resistance. I'm pleased to bring on Dame Sally Davies, Master of the Trinity College and former Chief Medical Officer of England, and Dr. Julie Gerberding, Executive Vice President and Chief Patient Officer at Merck. Dr. Gerberding?
This is such an honor for me to have a chance to speak with Dame Sally on this really important topic. There's probably no one in the world that has exhibited more international leadership in the fight against antimicrobial resistance than Sally. And yet, all of this effort and all of this time, and we still haven't really been able to come up with solutions that are sustainable and that work for people everywhere. So Sally, from your perspective, where have we come and where do we need to go to really deal with AMR?
There's so much we have to do. And thank you, Julie. I've respected and admired you from a distance too. We have to use what we've got better. We need innovation, new drugs, new diagnostics, and we need to make sure that the right drugs get to people all around the world. And we can only do that by partnership, the theme of today. But if we start with where we are today, we're in the middle of this COVID pandemic. And I think I want to make two comments on that. The first is that, of course, antibiotics are being given to people who have a virus, quite often out of hospital. But they're also being given to people because they're on ventilators and assisted ventilation. And vast amounts are being used. And this is not going to help our fight against antimicrobial resistance. We know that while access is a problem in parts of the world, overuse drives resistance. And yet, I would not want to be those clinicians. This is a very difficult moment, and they are doing a grand job. But we've got two pandemics going, and I've been talking about the lobster. And COVID is the lobster dropped into boiling water. And it's making a noise, and everyone's looking at it. But antimicrobial resistance is a lobster put in cold water, slowly heating up. It's going to die unless we take action. But it's still savable. We could take it out, and it's not making a noise. And actually, your role in pharma, your role because you're an esteemed microbiologist, but also as chief patient officer, is very important because we don't have a patient face for AMR, and so we don't have the patient pull. And I think that's why it's so difficult to get this up the agenda and there all the time. And I think we're going to have to think about how we ally AMR with the health security agenda. I've tried to do that for many years, but clearly COVID is pointing the way that that's where the policymakers are, and that's where the money will be. So how do we tap into it? What do you think?
Well, I would love to think this is a teachable moment. Many people are not aware of the toll that antimicrobial resistant infections are taking on patients with COVID. In a sense, they're a setup because they are sick, they are on ventilators, they have catheters, and they're in hospitals where these bacteria are particularly common. Because they're receiving a lot of ordinary antibiotics, the only surviving bacteria are the superbugs that are drug resistant. So we kind of have the perfect opportunity for these deadly pathogens to grow and spread among the sickest patients. And indeed, a sizable minority of people who die from COVID are not dying from the virus per se. They're dying because they have these secondary superbug infections. And I think that's part of the story that that gets lost in the broad concept of COVID. But it's exactly what you say. That's why we think of this as a individual patient challenge. It actually is a national security challenge, because almost any of the biological threats that we as a nation or a world need to prepare for will be accompanied by superbug complications. And yet our stockpiles and our pipeline of effective drugs to treat these infections is just as slim as our stockpile is for things like coronavirus. And here we are right now today with over 700 medications for either preventing or treating COVID. We do not have 700 new antibiotics in the pipeline, even though this problem has continued to evolve over several decades. It's that silent lobster in the cold water worming up pot that you just talked about. We've got to change that story. And I think in the industry, we're working on it. We've tried a lot of things. The market is a failure for reimbursement for antibiotics. The paradox is, if we overuse them, we lose them. So therefore, we have this perverse situation where we have to invest intensely to develop them, but then basically tell people, please don't use these unless you absolutely need to. And that is not supported by our current approach to reimbursement. One of the most recent things that I wouldn't call it an act of desperation, but it certainly is something that's unprecedented, is that the industry, the manufacturers themselves, have decided to pony up and create an AMR action fund where we're putting resources in to create a pool of investment to try to prime the pump for the pipeline development. That's only a temporary solution, and I have to admit this because even at Merck, where we've committed to put $100 million into this fund, we have to expect that at the end of the day, the policy environment will change so that we can eventually recoup that investment. And there's no guarantee for that. But that's where we need leaders like you and voices like yours who remind our policymakers of what needs to be done. So I'll turn this back over to you to hear a little more insight onto that, because I know this has been part of your mission in your former role, and I can't believe that it isn't still somewhere in your bailiwick, in your new role as the master at Trinity.
So I persuaded the government to make me their global special envoy on AMR.
Excellent.
Because I didn't think we were ready to give up. And I welcome what industry has done. I think it's incredibly important. But we don't pay enough for antibiotics. We're not valuing them for their good for society as global goods. And I'm very proud that in Britain we're trying this new pilot with a couple of antibiotics of trying a pull-through mechanism where we're doing very openly with industry playing in and watching and helping on every bit of modeling. We are valuing the 2 antibiotics in the pilot as to their value to the whole NHS, for reducing transmission of infections, for saving lives, not just that individual patient, as we judge every other medication. And actually, then we're paying a subscription to the company, and we nicknamed it the Netflix model. But if we can get this to work, and I think it will work in one form or another, then we will have potentially a viable model where it's a partnership. You've got to be able to fund the research, the development, the production, and the logistics to get it to patients. Maybe you don't need to make a big profit because you have other products as well. But, if we don't find pull-through mechanisms, we won't be where we need to be. So we must go on with the policy environment. I think making health security very important, but then all of us making this case that it's not just the odd pandemic every 5 years. There's this that's growing, and it must be taken seriously. And I know that I'm pushing very hard on that. I think we need to have better surveillance. We've been funding through the Fleming Fund surveillance in many countries, but we're also going to need much more collaboration we've just launched the Trinity Challenge, a collaboration between private sector who hold data and academia to work together on how to be better prepared for future pandemics, to pick them up before they get bad, to manage them better in response, and to recover better. It's no secret that I'm rather hoping we can slip AMR into those challenges as we go forward. But it is about collaboration, it's about data, and it's about supporting each other to move forward in the interests of the public and the patients, wherever they are in the world. So over to you.
Well, just this partnership model, and the concept of private-public partnerships is something we talk about at a lot of meetings and a lot of panels. But you've had this experience. From your point of view, what constitutes a successful partnership? Like, how do we actually get the value that we're looking for from these kinds of cross-sector engagements?
Well, you judge it by the impact it has at the end. But actually, if you've built trust through working together, then you can really build something that will produce not just one impact, but a number of ongoing impacts. And I think that we can do things. There's stuff to be done in the pre-competitive stage. There's sharing of all sorts of things. And it comes back to the recognition that each party brings something unique to the table, whether it's data or understanding about bugs or producing drugs and targets, whatever, and is valued for that. And you're aiming through that partnership to make a difference. And I think we can do it. And our partnership for the Trinity Challenge has the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but it is all private sector and academia working together from all the way across the world. And I'm impressed by how everyone does want to do it together.
Well, in a sense, as we kind of bring this conversation to a close, it isn't just about the sectors that you mentioned. There are a lot of people participating in this meeting who are influential, and I hope that people pay attention to the scale and scope of this problem and will serve as good ambassadors, find ways that they can either engage in supporting solutions to the AMR issue, or at the very least be good ambassadors for appropriate antibiotic use and help others understand the severity and the scope of this problem that we're facing.
Julie,
great to talk with you,
call
Sally.
to action. I'll add to your great call for action. You were talking about patients with COVID who are dying of AMR. We need to give a face to this. People need to understand it's killing people across the world, at least 700,000 a year at the moment. It's impacting GDPs already. We need to get everyone who watches this go out and say, so we've got a problem. It is soluble if we put our minds to it, and it'll be much cheaper to sort it than to wait till it is as bad as COVID is now, because we'll lose modern medicine. We won't be able to do normal cancer treatments or transplants. It'll be very worrying to have a major surgery or childbirth because you might catch an infection. The post-antibiotic apocalypse is scary. And so please, everyone, go out and think about your families and your children and grandchildren, because by pulling and saying to governments that they must sort this as part of health security as they go forward, working together on COVID, don't leave antibiotics and anti-infectives behind. There's my call to action. Julie made a powerful call to action. Working together, we can do this. And we blooming well need to.
Wonderful. I'm in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. We'll go forward together.